All right, welcome back to the Corporate Finance Academy. Today we are going to talk about the FP&A interview and how to best interview to get the job. All right, so in this video, we are going to go through the general do's and don'ts of approaching an interview, the most common reasons that people don't get jobs, the questions that you should be thinking about answering as you get into your interviews. We'll also talk about the questions that you should be asking, and then we'll wrap things up. Do's and don'ts. The first thing we're going to talk about here is be yourself. So I know this sounds cliche. I know some people think this is not maybe the advice that they're looking to hear, but most interviewers actually see through people acting fake or pretending to be somebody they're not. Don't try to be perfect. Perfection really says no self-awareness, and we'll get into that more when we talk about questions like what are your biggest weaknesses. Do prepare. It's definitely easier with public companies. With a public company, you should be going out and looking at the 10Q and the 10K, especially read the kind of introductory paragraphs as well as the management discussion analysis. You should definitely go look at a transcript or listen to the earnings call, the last one or two earnings calls, and pay attention to the Q&A. You should also look at what are analysts saying about the company right now. What are some recent things that have been in the news for? Are there any news articles about them? If it's a private company, it's a little more difficult to get information, but you should still Google the name, see if there's any news on them. Watch a LinkedIn, see if you can find anything on LinkedIn. Check out their website, of course, any stories, interviews, anything you can find about them, and try to just educate yourself a little bit. It's good to go and make sure you know who the CEO is, who the CFO is. It's good to know that stuff as you go into your sessions. But don't over prepare. And what I mean by that is, yes, you should prepare and learn as much as you can about the company, but don't over prepare on your answers. You don't want to sound too scripted. Know the main points that you want to hit, but don't script out a long paragraph about how you're going to answer a question because you don't know exactly what form that question is going to come in. You do want to try to make it conversational. This goes better for everyone. It's more enjoyable for you. You can work some of your questions in naturally. And you can just make it a more enjoyable interview by making it more like a back and forth conversation. You don't want to be too generic. And we'll get into this more when we get into the questions, but you should be able to say what you did, right? How you add value, what you yourself have actually done, some of the successes you've had. And you do that obviously without being arrogant, but you don't want to be too generic and just have these blanket statements like, I worked on this team and we did this. What did you do to help push that team? And then come with questions. This one's so easy. We'll touch on those questions, but you should never get to the end of an interview and say, no, I don't really think I have anything, or just have one question. You should have several that you've thought about, and then you see based on how the interview went, which ones make the most sense to use. And then don't forget to express interest. They should feel that you're actually interested in the job, that you actually want the job. And always send a thank you note. This isn't going to get you the job necessarily, but I've definitely had conversations where we're evaluating who to hire, and inevitably it comes up if we have two candidates that are close. Somebody will say, oh, this person sent me a thank you and this person did not. It's a small thing. It's a little thing. It also makes you top of mind to them. It reminds you that they were in. So within 12, 24, 36 hours, send the thank you. Okay, so the biggest reasons I see that people fail these job interviews are, one, when people aren't genuine. I really do believe that most interviewers are good at sniffing out somebody who's only giving answers like they want to hear, somebody who's not really being themselves, who doesn't seem kind of comfortable because they're pretending to be something else. you want to be the best version of yourself. And I know that sounds a little lame, but you want to communicate as good as you can communicate. You want to emphasize your strengths. You want to minimize your weaknesses, but you need to be genuine. You need to be yourself. Another one of the biggest reasons I see is when people can't speak to the specifics of what they actually did. So what did you do? Now, you don't want to go to an interview and have somebody say, I. You want to hear we's as well. You want to say, we worked on this or we worked together. But you also need to be able to say what you specifically did. That's very important. So many times I hear people say, when we're debriefing about candidates, I thought this person was pretty good, but they couldn't really talk to anything that they did or where they added value. You need to be able to explain your own skills and contributions that you've had to projects. People don't want to see you as just a part, like you were in a team that accomplished something. They want to know that you helped that team accomplish something. The next is if people are too arrogant or seem too perfect. You need to be confident, yet still humble. Understand that you don't know everything. Understand that you have weaknesses. Be aware of your self-development opportunities. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to say you have no weaknesses. And often I have this last one is not interested. We'll be talking about candidates and we'll say, that one person, I just don't know if they really wanted the job. I don't know if they cared. Now, this isn't where you have to turn into somebody you're not. Again, you don't have to pretend to have all this passion and be super animated or gregarious. You should just seem really curious, really interested in your own way. How do you express to that interviewer that you're very interested in this job? Through your engagement, through your questions, through your attention, through your inflection of your voice, and all of those type of things. Okay, so now let's get into the questions. So the first set of questions that you will likely encounter are financial and technical. And now these are in no particular order. They might ask you other behavioral questions first, but you will get into financial technical questions. The way you want to answer these is correctly, right? These often have right answers to them. You don't want to answer them like a robot where you just memorize something. Like, do it in your own words. And when you can provide an example or specifics, that's great. And they're asking you this really to see if you understand the subject matter. See if you can think through a question intelligently, you can communicate the answers concisely. All right, so some of the potential questions you'll see here are things like, can you explain the difference between the income statement, balance sheet, cash flow? How do they interrelate? How do you approach creating a financial model? What steps do you take to ensure its accuracy and reliability? What is a discounted cash flow model? Can you walk me through how you would make one? How do you determine the cost of capital? Why is that important? What methods would you use to analyze whether a project is financially viable? Can you explain the concept of variance analysis and how you use it in FP&A? Right? These are questions that you might see, and most of them have real answers, right? You should be able to talk about the differences between the income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow. You should be able to talk about how the cash flow has items from both the income statement and the balance sheet on it. You should know that there's an indirect and a direct. You should know CFOA, cash flow from investing activities, cash flow from financing activities. And you should be able to talk through, right? If you're creating a financial model, budgeting model, how would you start? And you want to be able to do these in a concise manner. So these are the types of questions that are out there that you could get snagged up on. So you want to be able to talk about them. You get these questions, you breathe, you take a minute, you think about it. And look, if it's something that you really don't know, just be honest and say, in my past roles, I haven't really had to do that. But I can learn things quickly. I did learn that in college. I would just have to dust it off. And here's how I would go about learning. I would go first reference my college textbook. Then I would go take a Udemy course to make sure I learned it. And then I would go to one of my peers that I've worked with in the past and talk through it with them and make sure I'm thinking about it the right way. So show them that even if you don't know something or you haven't encountered it in your job, you have a smart way of going about it. Okay, the classics. I call this one the classics. This is going to be your strengths and weaknesses. So the way you answer these is truthfully. You want to have a slight slant toward the role. And what I mean by that is, if one of your weaknesses is attention to detail and you're an FP&A, that's probably not a good thing. I don't know that I would say that's my weakness. I would think about other weaknesses I have. If you go in saying you have bad attention to detail in an FP&A role, they might just toss your resume in the circular file there. But be honest. You should be able to say, I have these development opportunities. I need to work on those. And you can talk about how you are working on it and what your plan is to address it. You don't have to say it's fixed. In fact, don't say it's fixed, because then you're doing the old thing of turning your weaknesses into strengths, and people actually don't really like that. They're asking you this to see if you're self-aware. Can you reflect on yourself? Do you take feedback? Do you seek out feedback? Do you have a self-improvement mindset? If you say you don't really have any weaknesses, or your weakness is you overcommit, that might be fine if you have a couple weaknesses, but just don't try to make yourself sound perfect in this. Be self-aware. Okay, the potential questions, this comes in many forms, but it'll be something like, how would your peers or former bosses or coworkers describe you? What do you do well? What don't you do well? They might be very direct and say, what are some words they would use to describe you? What do you do well? What do you not do well? What are your biggest assets or strengths? What areas you need development on? Could take different forms, but think about what the role requires and the strengths that you have, and try to make sure you're talking about strengths that would contribute to this role. Think about the weaknesses you have, and it is a good idea to try to give weaknesses which wouldn't necessarily preclude you from getting this job. So think through it, be strategic, but be able to talk about what those development opportunities y'all are. And sometimes it's just, you can mix things in, like real development opportunities where you just haven't had the time or exposure to something. And it can be things that are specific to a role. It could be something with the way you communicate. It could be lots of things, but take your time. Think through it, and it should be genuine, because if you say you're not a bad communicator, but you just crush your interview, they're going to say, wait a second, this guy is a good communicator. So just think through what those strengths and weaknesses really are for you. So tell me about a time, and this is related to your work. So you want to answer these with real examples, give specifics, and if it's possible, and if they've asked you the strength and development opportunities question, the classics from the last slide, you want to align with those. So if you say that you're, really bad at influencing people, but your story is how you influenced a whole department, those probably don't add up very well. So they're asking this to see specific example where you've helped the company, where you've added value, that you can speak intelligently to it, and that you can actually contribute to an organization. These are questions like, what projects are you most proud of? Tell me about a project you worked on where you made an impact, or tell me about a time when you added value, right? It could take many different forms, but it's that type of question. So you want to think ahead about your different roles and what you've worked on that you were really proud of, right? Where did you actually make an impact? Maybe you automated a process. Maybe you got rid of a bunch of work. Maybe you really helped out the sales team. Okay, problem solving, influencing, behavioral, kind of lumped all these together. To answer these, you want to use real examples. You want to show, if you can, that you've sat back and reflected on things and why it went well or didn't. You want to show that you've overcome obstacles. And you also want to show that you've worked well with others, even if there's been some conflict, right? And how do you resolve that? So they're asking to see if you can work in teams, if you can address problems, how you apply your skills to something. Can you show initiative, overcome adversity? Can you influence others? That's what they're looking for, all of these things. Potential questions that you might see here is, describe me a time when you had to take financial data, maybe even incomplete data, and use it to inform decision-making. How did you ensure your recommendations were sound? Can you give an example of a time when you identified risk or opportunity? What action did you take? You can see these other questions. How do you communicate financial information to non-finance people? What did you have to persuade your team or management to do something? How did you do it? What was the outcome? It might be, tell me about a time you disagreed with a peer or a teammate and how you got over that. So it's all these type of behavioral, tell me a time when. These are great opportunities, right? In a lot of these questions, you can have just 2 or 3 things you've worked on, and you can kind of use those 3 projects or experiences to answer almost any one of these questions. Think through some specific examples, have your talking points, show what you were able to do, how you worked with others. So this is where you might have a role where they are looking for very specific things. So they want somebody they're saying, hey, have you ever worked on SAP? Have you ever worked in Oracle? Have you ever used Tableau? So you want to answer these truthfully, but I think you can, the good strategy is to redirect to what you do know or how you learn or direct comparisons. So ultimately you want to show that you have a grasp on systems and tools, that you have an attention to detail and to data, you can extract and manipulate data, and you have learned things and you have an approach to learning, right? So if they say, hey, have you used Tableau? Maybe you haven't used Tableau. Maybe you've used another tool. Maybe it's like Spotfire or something like that. That's very similar. It's like a data visualization tool. You can say, no, I haven't, but I've used this one. And I know they're fairly similar. And I feel like I could quickly ramp up with that by taking a quick Udemy training course or using several different YouTube videos to understand how they work similarly and make sure I came up to speed quickly on it. But I know visualization tools, and I know I can utilize them, right? So you want to do stuff like that. You want to show them that you know how to do it, even if you don't have experience with their specific thing, and that should give them comfort. Culture fit, personal insight. These are questions where they're really just trying to get a feel for, if you're somebody they'd want to work with, somebody that would work well on the team. So give real answers. I've had people get caught on this. So I've had people say like, oh, I like to read. And I said, oh, what's a good book you've read lately? And I'm genuinely curious because I like to read, and they don't have anything. They stumble around. They don't, it's clearly they haven't read a book in a while, or they're just completely frozen. So, if you say you like to read, be ready to give a book recommendation. If you say you work out and they say, well, what do you like to do in your workouts? Be ready to answer those. People like to work with interesting people. So tell them about your hobbies. Tell them what you're interested in. You might find common ground. These questions are basic ones that you'll always see, and you can see them at the bottom here. Now it'll come time that you get to ask questions. So what are the type of questions that you would ask? So first, I group these a little bit, but the first is about the role, right? You can ask about the roles and responsibilities of the roles. Now, assuming they didn't cover that already, things they don't get from that role today that they would like to. You can ask them what success looks like. Who does it work with? People on the finance team, people outside of finance. Who do you spend the most time with in the role? What are the major priorities for somebody coming into the role? What are the biggest opportunities? What are the most important skills or systems that are used? What's the best thing about the role? Think about that right there. That's 7, 8 questions that you can ask just about the role, right? You should never come in and say, you know what? I think you covered everything. And then about the company and group, especially if it's a public company, there's tons of information you should have. So you should try to frame these questions around the things that you learned when you research them. This is where you show that you did your homework. This is where you can maybe separate yourself a little bit from your competition. So if you've seen any of the company in group challenges or priorities, you can say, hey, I read that the company is struggling with this thing. How do you think the company is dealing with it? Has that been a major impact? This is where you can show that you've done your homework. But you can also, if you don't have that public information, you can ask about the company's priorities, their challenges, opportunities. You can ask what the company culture is like. And, if you're not able to research the company itself, you can still look up industry trends or news articles about the company. You want to leave those sort of open-ended as questions. Now, the next one is about them. if this is your manager or this is, somebody who's not in finance or a peer or whatever it is, you can ask about them and the specific team that they work in and that this role work in, right? What's the management style like? Who all is on the team? How's it structured from an org perspective? What are the team strengths and weaknesses? How does this individual team fit into the rest of the company? Specific priorities of this team? What are some of the big cadences or rhythms? You can ask about, when they do budgeting. Do they forecast monthly or quarterly? Do they close the books monthly or quarterly? Ask all those type of things. What are big opportunities to be better? And the last one's general, right? You can put anything in here. If you haven't discussed it or you feel the need to, you can talk about in-office versus hybrid versus remote. Anything you're curious about from the whole conversation, all the questions they asked you, anything else you read about or learned, and you might even work in next steps here. Kind of depends on who you're meeting with. Think about this right here. This is 20 questions. These are super generic. You should be able to come up with an easy list of 20 plus questions, have maybe 5 circled that you really want to ask, and it should be easy to come up with questions. And if you don't, honestly, you probably can forget about getting that job because people want to see that you're curious and interested. But this is important stuff, right? This is how you get jobs. This is how you advance your career. But just to recap, right? Prepare, know your do's and don'ts, know your major bullet points on all the questions that you might get asked. Take time to really self-assess, look at your appraisal. If you've ever done a 360, or if you're able to do a 360-degree feedback, it's a great tool to better understand yourself. So be ready. But the last thing I say is always remember that a job interview is two-way. You should be trying to get the role for sure. You always want to put yourself in a situation where you're getting an offer and it's yours to turn down if you're seriously looking. But you should be seeing if this role or this company is a good fit for you, right? I and many people I know have learned this the hard way. If you go into a place that is a toxic work environment, it's horrible. Unless you're, like I say here, unless you're on the edge of personal bankruptcy, don't go into a role where your spidey sense is tingling and you're saying, I don't know if this is the right place to work. It should be a two-way interview, and you should be using your questions to try to gauge that. Right? To try to gauge if this is a place where you would actually like to work. And that's it. So if you have questions, leave them in the comments. Please do subscribe, like this video, join the newsletter. Thanks.